fascinating. I thought I was some kind of post-natural selection um, sentimentalist, but that's all right. You can call me a secular humanist. You can call me anything you like.
Okay, Gratex, you're an irrational, deluded, sentient, self-reflexive manifestation of energy slash matter in an amoral, meaningless, and pitilessly indifferent universe. You're a dying and defecating animal pinned to the surface of this planet by gravity as it orbits around a giant ball of gas comprised of hydrogen and helium in the vast expanses of outer space.
What do you mean you're post-natural selection? I mean, that's a misnomer. I mean, everything that has ever happened is natural. I mean, if it's post-natural selection, then that would mean it's no longer natural selection. In which case, it begs the question, what exactly is the type of selection that it would be from then onwards? Would it be supernatural selection? Um, you see, the thing is, abiogenesis everything originates life-wise from abiogenesis, and that set the parameters for what would follow onwards from that point. And abiogenesis clearly led towards irrational and illogical animals. Um, so anything that we design from now on in, that insanity and that irrationality is going to be reflected in what we construct, to modify ourselves, as you put it, and um, it's going to be a disaster. And when you say things like we can change ourselves, you make it sound as if the whole entire human race is going to push in the same direction. And you're overlooking the obvious fact that there are currently 7 billion individual Homo sapiens on this planet, all and each of them with their own attitudes and beliefs and value systems and likes and dislikes. And the conflict is inevitable. It's built into the very functioning of the DNA. You're not going to get a consensus or an anonymous decision on how to change human beings for what some people perceive as better and what other people perceive as being for the worst. So there's going to be it's going to widen the chasm between the haves and the have-nots, and there will be, an underlying current, an electrifying current of difference in opinion, which will lead to conflict, which will be reflected in the way people express their views against other different people who hold different views and values and belief systems. There is a conflict. There is war.
Well, biological imperative to live. I don't think such a thing exists. And I know people are, oh, you don't even think we want to live. How could you say something so against what everybody kind of believes? And I would say, no, the biological imperative is to avoid harm. It's like you're talking about the biological imperative to procreate. I don't think we have one. We've got a biological imperative to fuck. If it was a biological imperative to procreate, then we wouldn't masturbate, we wouldn't have sex with contraception, we wouldn't have any sex that we knew wasn't going to lead to procreation. We wouldn't be able to, because we know we get turned on when it came to procreation. You see, it's a biological imperative to fornicate, and it's a biological imperative to avoid harm. Now, those things may be results of those imperatives, like continuing to live as a result of the biological imperative to avoid harm. But it doesn't mean to say you have a biological imperative to live.
Okay, Gratex, look at the hierarchy of biological imperatives on the screen. These are not set in stone for every single human being who currently exists, because we are the product of a dumb, blind, and wasteful process known as evolution by natural selection. But this hierarchy indubitably captures something of the relative strengths of the biological imperatives manifested by a large percentage of human animals on this planet in the year 2012 AD. Now, if I had both the inclination and the capacity to populate a planet with Homo sapiens who would be able to ward off extinction for as sustained a period of time as possible, then these are pretty much the relative strengths of biological imperatives I would program into my creations. Survival would be top of the list because without a strong biological imperative to survive, there would be no room for high confidence levels that my creations would survive long enough to replenish their numbers. As we are all merely the latest link in a long chain of ancestors who all survived long enough to procreate, it is no surprise that the biological imperative to survive is the one the majority of the human race feels most keenly during the course of their lives. Secondly, I would mimic natural selection in terms of programming the biological imperative for territorialism in my Dr. Frankenstein monsters because, and I quote Wikipedia, observing living organisms in nature suggests that the step before procreation is to establish a territory within which they may hunt, breed, and ensure the growth of their offspring. This makes perfectly logical sense because if an organism cannot ensure that they will have enough access to food to support their offspring, it might compromise both the survival of the parents and also of their offspring. Thirdly, I would program the biological imperative to compete against other living organisms into my creations because without access to mates, the prospect of procreation would be unduly compromised. So those are the three biological imperatives which I feel would be the most keenly felt in my guinea pigs. However, I would also program a strong biological imperative to procreate. So that would be my fourth biological imperative. However, it would be less powerfully felt than the previous three biological imperatives because one needs to survive in order to procreate, one needs territory in which to raise offspring, and one needs to be competitive in order to compete for access to finite resources such as food and mates. So unless all these basic conditions are met, the biological imperative to procreate would be functionally useless given that my objective would be solely to create a species that could survive for as long as physically possible. The fifth biological imperative I would engineer in my creations would be quality of life seeking, and this function is important because if one improves the quality of one's life, there's a correlation between that and their chances of survival, which I won't expand upon in this video. And the sixth most keenly felt biological imperative I would engineer in my creations would be the desire to form groups because I would deem this important because without a biological imperative to form families, which is a form of groups, the babies would be vulnerable to neglect and thus death. Upon more reflection, I might consider swapping the fifth place biological imperative with a sixth place biological imperative, that is to say, moving group forming up to 5 and moving quality of life seeking down to number 6, because I think I would argue that in order to strengthen the chances of offspring surviving, human beings need to form groups in the form of families to improve their offspring's chance of survival. So I would possibly argue that, but apart from that, I think Wikipedia pretty much captures, the strength of the biological imperatives that I would program into my DNA creations. Now, when I say these are the biological imperatives that are felt most strongly, I don't necessarily mean on a conscious level, I mean on an unconscious, subconscious level, because of course biological imperatives can often function below the level of consciousness. I mean, if you look at all life on this planet, um, not all of them are perhaps conscious in the way that we would envisage that term, but nevertheless they have these strong biological imperatives dictating and mandating their behavior, which is why, you know, species just continue until they don't continue anymore and they become extinct. You know, that there's biological imperatives in them. And I think just because human beings are conscious and are intelligent and capable of abstract thinking, that does not mean that we are divorced from the rest of life forms in any kind of profound way. Um, but of course, I'm looking at this list. There are often differences in the strengths of biological imperatives within human beings. You know, for example, if you're suicidal, then that means that the quality of life-seeking criteria has reached a higher priority than the survival criteria, which obviously can result in the person taking their life because they place higher importance on quality of life seeking than survival. And also often there are many people who prioritize quality of life seeking over reproduction, you know, with the child free, not necessarily antinatalists, but they recognize that if they don't have children, then their quality of life seeking, their quality of life will be higher than if they don't have children. Now the question remains is, how would I create my sentient beings to not cotton on to the fact that they've been screwed? And I think a way I'd do this is exactly what we see in human psychology. You know, I would create the tendency for them to have very potent psychological defense mechanisms that stop them from cottoning on to the fact that they've been put in a situation that is hazardous and harmful for them. So I would program a certain amount of irrationality and insanity into my creations, so that they see or they think that there's some kind of inherent worth in survival and reproduction, and that, you know, so you've got like denial, repression, displacement, projection, you know, all these kinds of ways in which the mind can delude itself into thinking that the quality of life seeking is at the top of the list and survival and reproduction are merely ways of ensuring the quality of life is high, whereas in actuality all they're doing is perpetuating themselves needlessly and increasing the amount of human beings who are created and suffer and die. Now, it's interesting, Gratex, that you'd argue against survival and reproduction being biological imperatives, because I think that's pretty much the strongest argument one could possibly make against antinatalism. You know, the argument that reproduction is such a strong biological imperative that it's unreasonable to expect people to forego satisfying that biological imperative. But I would argue that looking at that list I have on the screen, the biological imperative to reproduce is lower than survival. You see, if antinatalism was a death or suicide cult, then we would be advocating people commit suicide, which is certainly not what antinatalism is about, hence the name, antinatalism. But people seem to confuse, you know, death cults with antinatalism, even though it says natalism in the title. You know, it's in the name. But yeah, I mean, I'd argue that because
reproduction is relatively low on our biological imperatives, it's not unreasonable to advocate abstaining from procreation. Now, just going back to this thought experiment where I program human beings to survive as a species for long as possible, one of the things I do is put a cap on the technological progress they're capable of making, which is clearly not how things are going down at the start of the 21st century. I mean, in the last few centuries, we've seen incredible technological progress without any current end in sight. And I think in the next few decades or centuries, the technologies that will be available will all pose significant and serious existential risks to our species. You know, I've talked in my previous videos about nanotechnology and AI and man-made viruses, and all of these risks are often undermined by people and poo-pooed, because I think a lot of it is to do with a positive bias. You know, they don't want to entertain thoughts that are unpleasant or anxiety-provoking, but that doesn't undermine the actual risks that they pose. I mean, just talking about nanotechnology, there's a hypothetical construct made from nanotechnology called the grey wool, sorry. Now, if something like that was constructed, it could possibly block out sunlight. You know, it could erect a wall around the Earth, preventing sunlight from reaching Earth. Now, if that happened, all life would be rendered extinct in about 3 days. You know, so yeah, I think DNA has made a big mistake here.